Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other military officers, though most people couldn't quite put their finger on why. At 32, she carried herself with a confidence that seemed almost too natural, too practiced. Her colleagues at the Pentagon knew her as General Mitchell, a rising star in military intelligence who had somehow climbed the ranks faster than anyone expected. What they didn't know was that her rapid promotion had nothing to do with politics or connections, and everything to do with a past she kept carefully hidden. The conference room on the third floor of the Department of Defense building was filled with the usual mix of military brass and civilian contractors. Sarah sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her uniform pressed to perfection. She listened as the heated discussion unfolded around her, taking notes in her characteristic neat handwriting while others raised their voices about budget allocations and strategic priorities. "The problem with you people," sneered Marcus Webb, a defense contractor whose company had been losing ground to competitors, "is that you think you can solve everything with more money and bigger weapons. You've never been in real combat. You sit in your air-conditioned offices making decisions about wars you've never fought." Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Webb was known for his aggressive tactics and his tendency to push boundaries, but he was also responsible for millions of dollars in contracts. Most people tolerated his behavior because his company produced results, even if his personality left much to be desired. Sarah continued taking notes, her expression unchanged. She had dealt with men like Webb before, though not in conference rooms. In her experience, the loudest voices often belonged to those who had the least actual experience with real danger. Take her, for example, Webb continued, pointing directly at Sarah. "General Mitchell here probably graduated from some fancy academy and worked her way up through paperwork and committee meetings. I bet she's never even held a weapon outside of basic training, let alone used one in combat. These desk warriors are the ones making decisions about life and death situations they couldn't handle themselves." The room fell silent. Several officers looked between Webb and Sarah, waiting to see how she would respond. Sarah's commanding officer, General Thompson, started to speak up in her defense, but she held up a subtle hand to stop him. "You make an interesting point, Mr. Webb," Sarah said calmly, setting down her pen and looking directly at him. "What kind of combat experience do you think would be most relevant for someone in my position?" Webb leaned back in his chair with a smug expression. "Real combat. Not simulation training or war games. I'm talking about actual missions where people shoot back, where you have to make split-second decisions that determine whether you and your team make it home alive. The kind of experience that teaches you what war really costs." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And you believe that kind of experience would make someone more qualified to make strategic decisions?" "Absolutely," Webb replied. "Anyone can learn tactics from a textbook, but you can't understand the reality of warfare until you've lived it. Until you've looked an enemy in the eye and pulled the trigger, you're just playing with other people's lives." The other contractors around the table were nodding in agreement. They had heard variations of this speech from Webb before, and while his delivery was often abrasive, many of them shared his sentiment that too many military leaders had risen through the ranks without seeing real action. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. She had spent years building her current identity, carefully crafting a background that would allow her to serve effectively without drawing unwanted attention to her past. But something about Webb's arrogance, his assumption that he could judge her capabilities based on her gender and current position, struck a nerve. "I appreciate your perspective, Mr. Webb," she said finally. "It's clear that you value practical experience over theoretical knowledge. That's actually something we have in common." Webb's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected her to become defensive or to hide behind her rank. Her calm response was not what he had anticipated. "The question is," Sarah continued, "what would you do if you discovered that someone in this room had exactly the kind of experience you're describing? Someone who had been in situations where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds, where a single mistake could result in mission failure and loss of life." "I'd say it was about time we had some real leadership in here," Webb replied, though his tone had lost some of its earlier confidence. Sarah smiled slightly, but there was something in her expression that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. It wasn't a warm smile or a political one. It was the kind of smile that suggested she knew something that others didn't, and that the revelation might not be pleasant. Mr. Webb, you mentioned looking an enemy in the eye and pulling the trigger, she said, her voice remaining perfectly level. Can you be more specific about what you think that experience teaches someone? Webb seemed to sense that he was walking into a trap, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. It teaches you that war isn't a game. It teaches you about fear, about adrenaline, about making decisions when your life and the lives of your teammates depend on getting it right. It teaches you to respect your enemy, even as you're trying to kill them. Those are valuable lessons, Sarah agreed. What about the technical aspects? The physical demands? The mental preparation required for operations where success depends on factors like breath control, heart rate management, and the ability to remain completely still for hours at a time. Now Webb was clearly confused. These weren't the kinds of questions he expected from a general whose background he assumed was limited to administrative duties. I'm not sure what you're getting at, General, he said, his voice more cautious than before. Sarah stood up slowly, her movement fluid and controlled in a way that spoke of extensive physical training. I'm getting at the fact that you're making assumptions about people based on limited information, Mr. Webb. You see a woman in a general's uniform sitting in a Pentagon conference room, and you assume you know her story. She walked around the table, not in an aggressive manner, but with the kind of purposeful movement that made everyone in the room pay attention. You assume that she's never been in real danger, never made life or death decisions, never had to rely on training and instinct to survive a situation where the smallest mistake would be fatal. Webb was watching her closely now, and for the first time since the meeting began, he seemed uncertain of himself. The truth is, Mr. Webb, that everyone in this room has a story. Everyone has a background that brought them to this table, to this decision-making process that you seem to think is so divorced from reality. Sarah had stopped walking and was standing directly across from Webb, her hands clasped behind her back in a classic military stance. Some people's stories are exactly what they appear to be on the surface. Others are more complicated. Some people have experiences that they don't talk about, qualifications that don't appear on their official biographies, training that was never meant to be discussed in rooms like this. The tension in the room was palpable now. Everyone could sense that something significant was happening, though most weren't sure exactly what it was. What are you saying, General? Webb asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. Sarah looked around the room, making brief eye contact with each person present. These were people she worked with regularly, people who thought they knew her. In a few moments, that was going to change forever. I'm saying that you should be careful about challenging people to prove their combat credentials, Mr. Webb, because sometimes they might actually have them. The silence that followed was complete. Outside, the sounds of Washington traffic continued, but inside the conference room, everyone was focused entirely on Sarah and the implications of what she had just said. Webb leaned forward in his chair, studying her face. Are you telling me that you have combat experience? Real combat experience. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes now that hadn't been there before. Something that spoke of experiences far removed from the bureaucratic world of the Pentagon. I'm telling you, Mr. Webb, that assumptions can be dangerous. In combat, assuming you know your enemy's capabilities can get you killed. In business, assuming you know your competitors' backgrounds can cost you contracts. In life, assuming you understand someone's qualifications can make you look foolish. She returned to her seat, but the dynamic in the room had changed completely. Everyone was looking at her differently now, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the hints she had just dropped about her past. Webb was silent for several seconds, clearly processing what he had heard. Finally, he spoke, his voice much quieter than before. General Mitchell, are you saying that you have the kind of combat experience I was talking about? Sarah picked up her pen and returned to her notes as if nothing had happened. I'm saying, Mr. Webb, that this meeting is supposed to be about resource allocation for the next fiscal year. Perhaps we should focus on that rather than making assumptions about people's backgrounds. But the seed had been planted. Around the table, minds were racing as people tried to piece together clues they might have missed. Sarah's unusual calmness under pressure, her reputation for understanding complex tactical situations, her rapid rise through the ranks despite her relative youth, suddenly, these facts were taking on new significance. Webb wasn't finished. His ego, bruised by the subtle challenge to his assumptions, pushed him to continue probing. With all due respect, General, you brought up the subject of combat experience. If you have something relevant to share with this group, something that would inform our decision-making process, I think we deserve to know about it. Sarah looked up from her notes, her expression still perfectly controlled. Mr. Webb, what exactly do you think you deserve to know? If you're claiming to have combat experience that would give you insights the rest of us lack, then, yes, I think we have a right to know the specifics. We're talking about billions of dollars in contracts and decisions that will affect military operations around the world. If you're basing your recommendations on actual field experience rather than theoretical knowledge, that's relevant information. The other people in the room were watching this exchange like spectators at a tennis match, their heads turning back and forth between Webb and Sarah. The tension was increasing with each exchange, and everyone could sense that something significant was building. Sarah set her pen down again and leaned back in her chair, considering Webb's challenge. She had spent years carefully maintaining her cover, building a reputation based on her administrative and intelligence skills, while keeping her operational background hidden. The official records of her SEAL service were classified at levels that even most of the people in this room couldn't access. But Webb's arrogance was pushing her toward a line she had never intended to cross. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Sarah spoke again. When she did, her voice carried a different quality than before, not louder, but somehow more commanding. Mr. Webb, let me ask you something. In your experience working with military contractors, how many active-duty Navy SEALs have you encountered? The question seemed to come out of nowhere, and Webb looked confused by the sudden shift in topic. SEALs? I'm not sure what that has to do with anything. I've worked with some special operations guys over the years. What? Just curious about your familiarity with that particular community, Sarah replied. In your interactions with them, what impressions did you form? About their training, their capabilities, their approach to problem solving? Webb was clearly trying to figure out where this line of questioning was leading. They're obviously elite operators. Highly trained, disciplined, capable of handling extremely difficult missions. I'm not sure what this has to do with our discussion about your combat experience, though. Bear with me, Sarah said. When you worked with these special operations personnel, did you ever encounter any that surprised you? Any that challenged your preconceptions about what a SEAL should look like or act like? Now, several other people in the room were beginning to look uncomfortable. The direction of Sarah's questions was becoming clearer, and the implications were starting to dawn on some of the quicker minds present. General Thompson, Sarah's direct superior, was staring at her with a mixture of shock and growing understanding. He had always known there were gaps in Sarah's official record, periods that were marked simply as classified assignments, but he had assumed they involved intelligence work rather than operational duties. Webb, however, was still focused on winning what he saw as a verbal sparring match. General Mitchell, I respect the SEALs, but I'm not sure what point you're trying to make. Are you suggesting that working with Special Operations Forces gives you the kind of combat experience we were discussing? Sarah shook her head slowly. No, Mr. Webb. I'm not suggesting that working with them provides that experience. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I'm suggesting that being one of them does. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several people gasped audibly. General Thompson's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Two of the contractors exchanged shocked glances. Webb's mouth fell open, and, for the first time since Sarah had known him, he was completely speechless. That's impossible, Webb finally managed. Women can't be SEALs. The program is restricted to men. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was a glint in her eye that suggested she was enjoying this moment more than she probably should. Mr. Webb, you seem very confident about military policies and procedures. Can you tell me when women were officially allowed to serve in all combat roles in the U.S. military? Webb's face was flushing now, partly from embarrassment and partly from anger at being challenged so directly. That was a few years ago. 2013 or 2014, I think. 2013, Sarah confirmed. And can you tell me how many women have successfully completed SEAL training since then? Webb was clearly struggling now. His expertise was in defense contracting, not military personnel policies. I don't know the exact numbers, but I assume it's been very few. The physical and mental demands are extreme. You're right about the demands being extreme, Sarah agreed. The success rate for male candidates is typically around 20 to 25%. For the small number of women who have been allowed to attempt the program, the rate has been even lower. She stood up again, and this time her movement had a different quality. Where before she had moved like a polished military officer, now there was something more predatory in her bearing, something that spoke of training far beyond what most people in the room had ever experienced. The question becomes, Mr. Webb, what would you say to someone who had successfully completed that training? Someone who had proven themselves capable of meeting those extreme physical and mental demands. Webb was staring at her now with a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. Are you seriously claiming to be a Navy SEAL? Because if you are, that's something that could be verified very easily. You're absolutely right, Sarah replied. It could be verified if someone had the appropriate security clearance and access to the right databases. Unfortunately, some records are classified at levels that protect both the individuals involved and the operations they participated in. General Thompson found his voice. Sarah, are you telling us that your background includes Special Operations Service? She turned to face him, and her expression softened slightly. Thompson had been a mentor to her, and she respected him enormously. She had never wanted to deceive him, but operational security had required it. General Thompson, there are aspects of my service record that I've never discussed publicly. Some of those aspects remain classified for security reasons that I'm sure you can understand. Thompson nodded slowly, but his expression showed that he was still processing this revelation. How long? He asked quietly. How long what, sir? How long were you operational? How many deployments? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Even now, there were limits to what she could reveal. Long enough to understand what Mr. Webb was talking about when he described looking an enemy in the eye. Long enough to have made the kinds of split-second decisions he mentioned. Long enough to know what it feels like when your training is the only thing standing between you and mission failure. The room was completely silent now. Everyone was staring at Sarah, trying to reconcile this new information with the woman they thought they knew. She had worked alongside them for months, attending meetings, reviewing reports, making recommendations about military strategy and resource allocation. None of them had suspected that her insights might be based on first-hand operational experience. Webb was the first to break the silence, and his voice was much more subdued than before. If what you're saying is true, then I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your background that were clearly incorrect. Sarah returned to her seat, her expression businesslike once again. Mr. Webb, you don't owe me anything. You raised valid points about the importance of practical experience in decision-making. I simply wanted to clarify that such experience comes in many different forms. But Webb wasn't finished processing what he had learned. His earlier arrogance was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. General Mitchell, when you said that looking an enemy in the eye teaches you to respect them even as you're trying to kill them, were you speaking from personal experience? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked directly at Webb, and, for just a moment, the professional mask slipped. In her eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The look of someone who had indeed faced life and death situations and emerged victorious. Mr. Webb, she said quietly, there are some questions that it's better not to ask. Some knowledge that civilian contractors don't need to have. Some experiences that we don't discuss in conference rooms. Webb swallowed hard, suddenly, understanding that his earlier taunts about killing generals had taken on a very different meaning. This wasn't just a Pentagon bureaucrat he had been challenging. This was someone who possessed skills and experience that he couldn't even imagine. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I withdraw my earlier comments about your qualifications. But Sarah wasn't quite finished with him. She had endured months of his arrogance and condescension, and now that the truth was partially revealed, she intended to make her point completely clear. Mr. Webb, earlier you said something about people in air-conditioned offices making decisions about wars they've never fought. You suggested that I had never held a weapon outside of basic training. You seemed very confident about those assumptions. Webb was looking increasingly uncomfortable as Sarah continued. You also made some remarks about what you would do to generals who made decisions you disagreed with. Something about killing them, if I remember correctly. Now Webb was genuinely alarmed. Several other people in the room were looking at him with expressions ranging from disapproval to outright hostility. His earlier comments, which had seemed like typical contractor bravado, now appeared to be threats directed at someone who was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. General Mitchell, those comments were completely inappropriate, and I apologize unreservedly. I was speaking out of frustration with the procurement process, not making any kind of actual threat. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his apology, but she wasn't quite done making her point. Mr. Webb, let me share something with you about special operations training. One of the things they teach you is situational awareness, the ability to assess threats and respond appropriately to changing circumstances. She leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining conversational, but somehow more intense. They also teach you about escalation management, how to de-escalate potentially dangerous situations before they become actual problems. These are valuable skills not just in combat, but in all kinds of interpersonal situations. Webb was nodding frantically, clearly hoping she would accept his apology and move on. The thing about situational awareness, Mr. Webb, is that once you develop it, you never really turn it off. You notice things. You pick up on subtle cues. You become very good at reading people and understanding their true intentions. She sat back in her chair, her expression returning to its earlier neutrality. So when someone makes repeated comments about killing military officers, even in what they claim is jest, someone with that kind of training tends to take notice. The implication was clear, and Webb's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand that his months of aggressive posturing had been noticed and evaluated by someone far more capable than he had realized. General, he said, his voice shaking slightly, I want to be absolutely clear that I have never intended any threat toward you or any other military personnel. My comments were unprofessional and inappropriate, but they were never meant as actual threats. Sarah studied him for a moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of his statement. Finally, she nodded. I appreciate that clarification, Mr. Webb. I'm sure you understand why it's important to be very clear about these things. The meeting continued for another hour, but the dynamic had changed completely. Webb sat quietly, speaking only when directly asked a question. The other contractors were more respectful and deferential than they had been in previous meetings. And everyone kept stealing glances at Sarah, trying to process what they had learned about her background. As the meeting concluded and people began gathering their papers, General Thompson approached Sarah's chair. General Mitchell, he said quietly, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Sarah nodded and followed him out of the conference room to his office down the hall. Once the door was closed, Thompson turned to face her with an expression of mixed admiration and concern. Sarah, how much of what you just revealed in there is going to cause problems for operational security? She had been expecting this question. Nothing I said was specifically classified, General. I didn't mention unit designations, operation names, locations, or time frames. I simply confirmed that I have the kind of background Mr. Webb claimed I lacked. Thompson nodded, but his expression remained troubled. That man has been a problem for months. His attitude toward military leadership, his comments about combat experience. I've been looking for a way to address it without creating a bigger issue with his company. And now? Sarah asked. Thompson smiled for the first time since the meeting had ended. Now I think Mr. Webb is going to be much more respectful in future interactions. The question is, what happens when word of this gets around? Because you know it will. Sarah had considered this possibility extensively. Once the truth about her background became known, even partially, it would change everything about how people perceived her and interacted with her. I understand the risks, sir. But I was tired of listening to his threats and his assumptions about my capabilities. Sometimes you have to draw a line. Thompson studied her face carefully. Sarah, in all the time I've known you, I've never seen you lose your temper or act impulsively. What you did in there was calculated. You had a specific goal in mind. What was it? Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal to her superior officer. Finally, she spoke. General Thompson, Mr. Webb has been making increasingly aggressive comments for months. Not just about military leadership in general, but about specific individuals. His behavior was escalating, and I was concerned about where it might lead. You thought he was becoming a genuine threat. I thought he was someone who needed to understand that his words have consequences, and that the people he was targeting might not be as helpless as he assumed. Thompson nodded slowly, understanding the larger implications of what Sarah was telling him. And now he knows that at least one of his targets has the training and experience to respond if his threats ever became more than just words. Now he knows, Sarah agreed. But neither of them realized that Webb's reaction to this revelation would be far more extreme than either had anticipated, and that Sarah's decision to partially reveal her background was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. 3 days after the conference room confrontation, Sarah arrived at her office to find her secure phone ringing with an urgent call from General Thompson. His voice was tense when she answered. "Sarah, we have a problem. Can you come to my office immediately? And bring your personal security detail if you have one assigned." "Sir, I don't have a security detail assigned. Should I be concerned?" There was a pause. "Yes, you should. We'll discuss it when you get here." Sarah gathered her files and walked quickly to Thompson's office, her mind racing through possible scenarios. When she entered, she found not only Thompson but also Colonel Martinez from Base Security and Agent Chun from the Defense Intelligence Agency. "General Mitchell, please have a seat," Thompson said, his expression grim. "We have some information that directly concerns your safety and the security of this facility." Agent Chun opened a file and spread several photographs across Thompson's desk. Sarah recognized Marcus Webb in several of the images, but he was meeting with people she didn't know. "After your encounter with Mr. Webb 3 days ago, we decided to take a closer look at his activities and associations," Chun explained. "What we found was extremely concerning." Sarah studied the photographs. Webb appeared to be in intense discussions with several men who looked like ex-military contractors, but something about their bearings suggested they might be more than simple business associates. Webb has been in contact with a group of individuals who have expressed hostile attitudes toward current military leadership, Colonel Martinez continued. "Some of these individuals have backgrounds in private military contracting, and some have expressed extremist political views." Thompson leaned forward in his chair. "Sarah, after Webb left the meeting 3 days ago, he apparently spent considerable time researching your background. He contacted several people trying to verify or disprove your claims about special operations experience." "And what did he find?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "He found enough classified references to convince himself that you were telling the truth about your SEAL background," Chun replied. But instead of deterring him, this information seemed to make him more agitated, not less. Sarah felt a cold knot forming in her stomach. "More agitated how?" Chun pulled out another set of documents. "We intercepted communications suggesting that Webb and his associates view you as a symbol of everything they believe is wrong with current military policies. A woman in a general's position with elite special operations training represents what they see as the military's drift away from traditional values." "In other words," Thompson said grimly, "your revelation didn't intimidate Webb. It made you a target." Sarah absorbed this information calmly. Her SEAL training automatically is shifting her into threat assessment mode. What kind of target? Are we talking about professional retaliation or something more serious? "We're not entirely sure yet," Agent Chun admitted. But some of the intercepted communications included discussions about making an example of officers who they believe are unqualified for their positions. The language was vague enough to maintain plausible deniability, but specific enough to be concerning. Colonel Martinez pulled out a timeline that showed Webb's activities over the past 3 days. He's been unusually active, meeting with people he doesn't normally associate with, making phone calls to contacts in several different states. The pattern suggests he's organizing something. Sarah studied the timeline carefully. Her operational experience had taught her to look for patterns and connections that might not be obvious to others. "Colonel, do we know anything about these new associates of his? Their backgrounds, their capabilities?" "That's one of our biggest concerns," Martinez replied. "Several of them have military backgrounds, including some with special operations experience. They have the skills and knowledge to plan and execute sophisticated operations." Thompson was watching Sarah's face as she processed this information. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly. Given your background and training, how would you assess this threat?" Sarah was quiet for several moments, considering not just the information she had been given, but also her own observations of Webb's behavior over the past several months. Finally, she spoke. "General, Based on what you've told me and what I observed about Webb's personality, I would assess this as a credible and escalating threat. Webb is someone who sees the world in very black and white terms. He doesn't handle challenges to his worldview well, and he has a tendency to personalize disagreements. She pointed to one of the photographs showing Webb in intense conversation with a man who had the unmistakable bearing of a former military operator. More importantly, Webb has access to people with the skills and motivation to act on his grievances. If he's convinced them that I represent some kind of threat to military values or national security, they might be willing to take action that Webb himself wouldn't be capable of. Agent Chen nodded grimly. Our assessment aligns with yours. We believe there's a significant possibility that this group is planning some kind of operation targeting you specifically. What kind of operation? Sarah asked. That's what we're trying to determine, Chen replied. It could range from an attempt to publicly embarrass you by somehow exposing classified details of your background, to a more direct physical threat. Sarah felt the familiar calm that came over her in dangerous situations, the mental state that her SEAL training had ingrained so deeply that it was now automatic. What resources do we have for monitoring their activities? Thompson exchanged glances with Agent Chun before answering. That's complicated, Sarah. Some of these individuals are U.S. citizens with no criminal records. We have limited ability to conduct surveillance without specific evidence of criminal intent. And, Colonel Martinez added, we have to consider the possibility that there are sympathizers within our own organization or allied agencies. Webb has had access to classified facilities and personnel for years through his contracting work. He may have developed relationships that could compromise our security. Sarah understood the implications immediately. You're saying we can't trust normal security protocols because we don't know who might be feeding information to Webb's group. Exactly, Thompson confirmed. Which brings us to why we called you here. We need to discuss your personal security arrangements. Sarah had been expecting this conversation, but she wasn't looking forward to it. General, with respect, I don't need a babysitter. My training includes personal protection and threat assessment. I'm probably better qualified to handle this situation than most security personnel you could assign. That may be true, Agent Chen interjected, but you're also the primary target. Personal protection protocols exist for a reason, and one of those reasons is that even highly trained individuals can't maintain constant vigilance while also performing their regular duties. Thompson leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's expression. There's another factor to consider, Sarah. If Webb's group is planning something public, an attempt to embarrass you or expose your background, having obvious security protection might actually serve their purposes by confirming that you're important enough to warrant such measures. Sarah considered this angle. On the other hand, visible security might deter them from attempting a more direct approach. True, Chen agreed. But it might also push them toward a more sophisticated plan. These are people with military training and experience. They know how to adapt their tactics based on their target's defenses. The conversation was interrupted by Thompson's secure phone. He answered it, listened for several moments, then hung up with a troubled expression. That was base security, he said. Someone attempted to access your personnel files an hour ago using what appeared to be legitimate credentials. The attempt was blocked by security protocols, but it suggests that Webb's group is actively trying to gather more information about you. Sarah felt a surge of anger, but her training kept her expression neutral. Do we know who made the attempt? Not yet, Thompson replied. But the credentials that were used belong to someone with legitimate access to personnel databases. Either someone with proper clearance is helping them, or they've somehow compromised an authorized user's login information. Agent Chun was making notes in his file. General Mitchell, this escalation suggests that we need to take immediate protective measures. I strongly recommend that we implement a security protocol that includes both personal protection and restricted access to your location and schedule. Sarah understood the necessity, but the idea of being constantly shadowed by security personnel was deeply frustrating. Her SEAL training had emphasized self-reliance and independence. The thought of being protected by others went against every instinct she had developed over years of operational service. Agent Chun, what specific measures are you recommending? Chen consulted his notes. First, we assign a close protection team with you at all times when you're outside secure facilities. Second, We restrict knowledge of your schedule and location to only essential personnel. Third, we implement additional security measures for your residence and transportation. And fourth, Thompson added, we consider whether you should be temporarily relocated to a more secure facility until we can neutralize this threat. Sarah shook her head immediately. General, relocating me would accomplish exactly what Webb wants, removing me from my position and disrupting my effectiveness. I won't be driven into hiding by someone who can't accept that women can serve effectively in combat roles. Colonel Martinez spoke up. General Mitchell, with respect, this may not be about what you're willing to accept. If there's a credible threat to your safety, we have a responsibility to protect you regardless of your personal preferences. Sarah turned to face Martinez directly. Colonel, my personal preferences are based on tactical assessment, not ego. If I disappear or suddenly require obvious security protection, it confirms Webb's narrative that I'm somehow unfit for my position. It also gives his group a propaganda victory that could encourage similar actions against other female officers. Thompson was nodding slowly as Sarah spoke. You're saying that how we respond to this threat has implications beyond just your personal safety. Exactly, Sarah replied. If we treat this as a standard protection situation, we're essentially admitting that Webb was right to challenge my qualifications. But if we handle it in a way that demonstrates confidence in my abilities, we send a different message entirely. Agent Chen looked skeptical. General Mitchell, what are you suggesting? That we ignore the threat and hope it goes away? Sarah smiled slightly, and once again there was something in her expression that reminded everyone in the room that her background was very different from what they had originally assumed. Agent Chen, I'm suggesting that we handle this threat the way special operations personnel are trained to handle threats, by taking the initiative rather than just reacting defensively. The room was quiet as the implications of her suggestion sank in. Finally, Thompson spoke. Sarah, are you proposing that we actively pursue Webb's group rather than simply protecting you from them? I'm proposing that we gather intelligence on their activities and capabilities, identify their plans and timeline, and position ourselves to disrupt their operation before they can execute it, Sarah replied. In special operations, the best defense is often to become the hunter rather than remaining the prey. Agent Chun and Colonel Martinez exchanged glances. This wasn't the kind of response they had expected from someone who was supposedly the target of a threat. General Mitchell, Chun said carefully, what you're describing sounds more like a counterintelligence operation than a personal protection detail. Sarah's smile widened slightly. Agent Chun, one of the advantages of having actual operational experience is understanding that there are often more options available than the obvious ones. Thompson was studying Sarah's face intently. What specifically are you proposing? Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Pentagon parking lot where hundreds of military and civilian personnel went about their daily routines, unaware of the drama playing out in the offices above them. I'm proposing that we use Webb's assumptions about my capabilities against him, she said without turning around. He thinks he's hunting someone who is unprepared for his kind of threat. Let's allow him to continue thinking that while we gather the intelligence, we need to neutralize his operation. When she turned back to face the room, her expression had changed completely. Gone was the bureaucratic general who attended budget meetings and reviewed procurement reports. In her place stood someone who looked very much like the special operations veteran she claimed to be. Gentlemen, Marcus Webb made a serious mistake 3 days ago. He challenged someone to prove their combat credentials without considering what might happen if they actually had them. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Agent Chun, Colonel Martinez, and General Thompson were all looking at Sarah with new respect and a growing understanding that they were no longer dealing with a typical threat protection scenario. Webb and his associates think they're planning an operation against a target who will respond predictably to their tactics, Sarah continued. They're about to discover that their intelligence about their target was incomplete. Thompson leaned forward in his chair. Sarah, what exactly are you planning? Sarah's plan unfolded over the next week with the precision of a military operation, because that's exactly what it was. Instead of hiding behind security protocols, she had convinced Thompson and Agent Chun to let her take the lead in gathering intelligence on Webb's group while appearing to maintain her normal routine. The key breakthrough came when Sarah suggested using her own background as bait. She began making subtle inquiries about Webb's recent activities, asking questions that would naturally find their way back to him through the defense contracting community's informal network. To Webb and his associates, it would appear that she was trying to investigate them while lacking the skills to do so effectively. What Webb didn't realize was that every contact he made in response to these inquiries was being monitored by Agent Chen's team. Every meeting he arranged was observed. Every phone call he placed was recorded. Within 5 days, they had a complete picture of his plans. The operation Webb had organized was more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated. His group included 6 former military contractors with combat experience, and their plan involved multiple phases designed to simultaneously embarrass Sarah professionally and neutralize her personally. They intended to publicly expose her SEAL background while claiming that her selection had been based on political correctness rather than merit, then stage an incident that would demonstrate her inability to handle a real threat. They're planning to create a situation where you'll be forced to respond to a simulated attack, Agent Chen explained during a briefing in Thompson's office. Their goal is to provoke a reaction that they can film and use to claim that you're either too aggressive for a general's position or too weak to handle real danger. Sarah studied the intelligence reports with growing anger. In other words, they're planning to manufacture evidence to support their preconceived conclusions about my fitness for command. Exactly, Thompson confirmed. And they're arrogant enough to believe they can control the outcome because they assume you don't have the training or experience to recognize what they're doing. Colonel Martinez pointed to a timeline that showed Webb's planned sequence of events. They intend to stage this confrontation at next week's defense contractors' reception. It's a public venue with multiple witnesses and media coverage. Maximum exposure for whatever narrative they want to create. Sarah was quiet for several moments, considering the tactical situation. The reception would be held at a hotel in downtown Washington, with approximately 300 attendees including senior military officers, government officials, and defense industry representatives. Security would be present, but limited, and the informal nature of the event would make it difficult to control access or predict movement patterns. Agent Chen, do we have audio surveillance on their planning sessions? Chen nodded and played a recording of Webb's voice outlining his strategy. Sarah listened with growing amazement at the man's complete misunderstanding of what he was dealing with. In the recording, Webb was explaining to his associates how they would approach her during the reception. Remember, she's never faced a real threat situation outside of controlled training environments. When we create the appearance of danger, her response will either be inadequate or excessive. Either way, we'll have evidence that she's unfit for her position. Sarah looked up at the other officers in the room. He's planning to create what he thinks will be a no-win scenario for me. Either I respond with appropriate force, and he claims I'm too aggressive, or I don't respond effectively, and he claims I'm too weak. What he doesn't realize, Thompson observed, is that someone with your background has been trained to handle exactly these kinds of scenarios. Sarah nodded, but her expression was troubled. The problem is that he's chosen a public venue with civilians present. Any response I make has to take their safety into account, which limits my options considerably. Agent Chun was studying Sarah's face carefully. General Mitchell, what are you thinking? Sarah stood up and walked to the whiteboard where the timeline of Webb's plan was displayed. I'm thinking that Mr. Webb has made several tactical errors that we can exploit. She picked up a marker and began annotating the timeline. First, he's assuming that I'll be surprised by whatever he does. That assumption allows us to prepare countermeasures. Second, he's planning to create a scenario where my reaction will be captured on video, which means there will be evidence of whatever actually happens. Third, he's chosen to involve multiple people in his plan, which increases the chances that someone will make a mistake or reveal information they shouldn't. Thompson was following her analysis with growing interest. What do you propose we do with those advantages? Sarah continued writing on the whiteboard. We turn his plan against him. Instead of reacting to his scenario, we create our own. Instead of defending my qualifications, we demonstrate them. Instead of allowing him to control the narrative, we show everyone exactly what those qualifications mean in practice. Colonel Martinez looked concerned. General Mitchell, what you're describing sounds like you're planning to escalate the situation rather than de-escalate it. Sarah turned to face him directly. Colonel, Mr. Webb has been making threats against military officers for months. He's organized a group of armed individuals to target a general officer of the United States military. He's planning to stage what amounts to an assault in a public venue with civilians present. This isn't a situation that can be de-escalated through normal diplomatic channels. Agent Chun was nodding in agreement. She's right, Colonel. Webb has moved beyond making threats. He's actively planning what could be classified as a terrorist operation targeting military leadership. Which brings us to an important legal consideration, Thompson added. If Webb and his associates attempt to carry out their plan, they'll be committing federal crimes. We have the right and responsibility to prevent those crimes from occurring. Sarah returned to her seat, her expression serious. Gentlemen, I want to be very clear about what I'm proposing. I'm not suggesting that we start a firefight at a reception with 300 civilians present. I'm suggesting that we use Webb's own plan to expose the true nature of his threat and demonstrate why his assumptions about my capabilities were incorrect. She pulled out a folder that contained detailed floor plans of the hotel where the reception would be held. Webb's group has been surveilling the venue for 3 days. They've identified what they believe are optimal positions for their operation. What they haven't considered is that their surveillance activities have been observed and their positions are now known to us. Agent Chun was studying the floor plans with growing understanding. You're planning to turn their ambush into a counter-ambush. I'm planning to give them exactly what they think they want while ensuring that the outcome is very different from what they expect, Sarah replied. Webb wants to create a scenario that demonstrates my unfitness for command. Instead, we're going to create a demonstration of exactly why my background and training make me extremely well qualified for my position. Thompson was examining the floor plans and the intelligence reports on Webb's team. Sarah, this is extremely risky. If anything goes wrong, if anyone gets hurt, the political consequences could be devastating. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his concern. General, I understand the risks. But consider the alternative. If we allow Webb to proceed with his plan, best-case scenario is that he succeeds in embarrassing me and undermining confidence in military leadership. Worst-case scenario is that his staged incident turns into a real one and people actually get hurt. She pointed to the intelligence reports. These men aren't playing games, sir. They have military training, access to weapons, and they genuinely believe they're serving some higher purpose by targeting me. Whether we intervene now or later, there's going to be a confrontation. I'd rather have it happen when and where we can control the circumstances. Colonel Martinez was still looking skeptical. General Mitchell, what if Webb's group doesn't respond the way you expect them to? What if they escalate beyond what you're prepared for? Sarah's expression became very serious, and once again, everyone in the room was reminded that they were dealing with someone whose background was far more operational than administrative. Colonel, one of the fundamental principles of special operations is that you never initiate an action unless you're prepared to finish it. If Webb and his associates want to test my combat credentials, they're going to get a very thorough demonstration of what those credentials actually mean. The room was quiet for several moments as everyone absorbed the implications of what Sarah was proposing. Finally, Agent Chin spoke. General Mitchell, if we proceed with your plan, we'll need to coordinate with multiple agencies to ensure proper legal authority and backup support. This isn't something we can improvise. Sarah had already considered this requirement. Agent Chun, I've prepared a detailed operational plan that addresses legal authority, backup support, civilian safety, and evidence preservation. The plan is designed to ensure that Webb's group has every opportunity to withdraw peacefully before any physical confrontation occurs. She handed Chun a thick folder. But if they choose to proceed with their operation, the plan also ensures that we're prepared to respond with appropriate force while minimizing risk to bystanders and preserving evidence of their criminal intent. Thompson took a copy of the operational plan and began reviewing it. As he read, his expression shifted from concern to amazement to something approaching admiration. Sarah, this isn't just a security plan. This is a complete intelligence and counterterrorism operation. The level of detail, the contingency planning, the coordination requirements. Where did you learn to plan operations at this level? Sarah's answer was simple and direct. SEAL Team 6, sir. Advanced tactical planning was part of my operational training. The silence that followed was complete. Agent Chun and Colonel Martinez were staring at Sarah with expressions of shock and dawning understanding. Thompson was studying her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. SEAL Team 6, Thompson repeated quietly. Sarah, are you telling us that your background includes service with the most elite special operations unit in the U.S. military? Sarah nodded calmly. Yes, sir. For 4 years. 12 deployments. Operations in 7 different countries. Agent Shin found his voice first. General Mitchell, why wasn't this information included in the briefings we received about your background? Because it's classified at levels that require specific need-to-know authorization, Sarah replied. Until now, there hasn't been a tactical situation that required you to have that information. Thompson was still processing this revelation. Sarah, SEAL Team 6 operators are selected from the regular SEAL teams based on exceptional performance and advanced capabilities. The training, the operational tempo, the types of missions, you're talking about experience that maybe 50 people in the entire world possess. Which is exactly why Webb's plan is going to fail so spectacularly, Sarah replied with a slight smile. He thinks he's targeting a general who got her position through affirmative action policies. Instead, he's targeting someone who was selected for the most elite military unit in existence based on operational performance. Colonel Martinez was shaking his head in amazement. General Mitchell, with that level of background, why didn't you simply tell Webb exactly who he was dealing with from the beginning? Sarah's expression became more serious. Colonel, operational security protocols exist for important reasons. My SEAL Team 6 background is information that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger current team members if it became public. I revealed as little as possible while still making it clear that Webb's assumptions about my capabilities were incorrect. But he didn't take the hint, Agent Shin observed. No, he didn't. Which means that Mr. Webb is about to receive a much more comprehensive education about the realities of challenging special operations personnel. Thompson closed the operational plan folder and looked directly at Sarah. General Mitchell, I'm going to approve your plan with one modification. I want additional backup teams positioned around the venue, and I want real-time communication with FBI and local law enforcement throughout the operation. Sarah nodded her agreement. Yes, sir. I anticipated that requirement and included coordination protocols in the appendices. Agent Chun was already reaching for his phone to begin coordinating with other agencies. General Mitchell, how confident are you that this plan will resolve the Webb situation permanently? Sarah's answer was delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had faced much more dangerous situations than anything Marcus Webb could imagine. Agent Chun, by tomorrow evening, Mr. Webb and his associates will have a very clear understanding of why challenging the combat credentials of special operations veterans is generally considered to be a serious mistake. The reception was held the following evening at the Grand Washington Hotel, exactly as Webb had planned. What he didn't know was that his every move was being monitored by teams of federal agents, that his communications were being intercepted in real time, and that his target was not only aware of his plan but had prepared countermeasures that would turn his operation into a demonstration of capabilities he couldn't possibly have imagined. As Sarah entered the hotel lobby, wearing her dress uniform and displaying the confidence of someone who was completely in control of the situation, Webb and his associates moved into position exactly as their surveillance had indicated they would. What happened next would become the subject of classified reports that would be studied at military academies and law enforcement training facilities for years to come. But, for Marcus Webb, it would be a lesson in the dangers of making assumptions about people whose true capabilities were far beyond anything he had ever encountered. Webb had wanted to test Sarah's combat credentials. He was about to discover that some tests have very serious consequences for the people who conduct them.